and it's with great pleasure that I welcome you to this second workshop in the series called Dialogues 2016, in which we're looking at how governance and constitutions interact. Before introducing our guest speaker tonight, let me just mention that the founding director of the Institute and a very important figure in the governance program, which is the umbrella program under which we are holding this series, has just been conferred the title of Professor Emeritus. This is Abdul Fidadi Ansari. So I think it's good for us to somehow remember and celebrate this thing tonight. It's also a very great pleasure to be with Said Arjomand again. He is a very distinguished sociologist. He has been based forever at Stony Brook State University of New York University. And it's also a pleasure because he, as a sociologist, has been heavily engaged with the problem or the issue of constitutional politics. So I think he will bring in these insights into tonight's discussion. What we asked Said in this series is to somehow place the issue of governance regulations in historical context. So, of course, as many of you know, Said is an expert in Iranian constitutional politics, but not only, but he will also branch out to other countries in the region. I will not bore you with the list of publications which Said produced, but I strongly suggest you take a look at them. Again, so with no further ado, let me please join me in welcoming Said to our series.
Thank you very much. Thank you. So, to put this issue of governance in the Iranian constitutions of the, 20th century, the title of it. As you know, there was two laws. There was the, in 1906, end of it, December, there's a fundamental law, and then, of course, then a few months later, in October of 1907, they added a supplement to the fundamental law. And then that brings us to the Constitution of 1979, after the Islamic Revolution, Constitution of the Islamic Republic of Iran, which was amended in 1989 quite substantially. And that's where we are. These are the four constitutions to look at with a glance at constitutional politics in between, and then some comparative remarks on with the other parts of the world. So to do this, I think the first point to make is that unlike the Ottoman Empire, where the monarch was both the Sultan and the Caliph, and of course you recall that Mustafa Kemal abolished those two in sequence, one by one, 1923 and 1924. So unlike the Ottoman Empire, where the monarch was both Sultan and Caliph, the monarchy was secular in Iran, certainly by the 20th century, because of the growth of an independent Shiite hierarchy in the preceding 2 centuries, in the 18th and 19th centuries. So the issue of sovereignty was entirely unproblematic. The constitutionalization of the principle of national sovereignty by the makers of the 1906-7 fundamental laws simply meant the transfer of sovereignty in the new constitutional state from the Shah to the nation, Millat, and did not pose a conceptual problem, and therefore did not generate any debates Although I should point out that when they took the fundamental supplement to fundamental law to the new king, Muhammad Ali Shah, to sign, he just put it in his own hands against where it said sovereignty is entrusted by the nation, that led to the Shah, to the king. Sovereignty said, he put brackets and said, by divine grace. Now, they actually went ahead and published that, but that really was no debate at all. He just simply added that little sentence there. And so the issue of sovereignty of God, now this is, of course, the big problematic thing that was so troublesome in its resolution and consequences in the making of the 1956 Constitution of the Islamic Republic of Pakistan, never arose. Now, the implication of this transfer of sovereignty for governance was worked out roughly according to the model of the constitutional monarchy in the 1831 Constitution of the Kingdom of Belgium. The executive power of this state was held by the ministers under a prime minister on behalf of the nation. If ministers of the state were acting for the sovereign, now the new sovereign, the sovereign nation, were they also responsible to the Majlis, the Iranian parliament, as the elected representatives of the nation? The section addressing this issue in the Fundamental Law of December 1906 is significantly entitled On the Functions, Limits, and Rights of the Majlis. And it contained a number of ambiguities. Now, as the Constitution was a royal grant, specifying the rights of Parliament being instituted by the Shah seemed appropriate. Now, among the rights of the Majlis, that the Majlis thus received was the right to question ministers, in other words, the right of interpellation. The Majlis could, however, only request that the Shah dismiss a minister who failed to provide satisfactory answers according to, and I quote Article 29, according to the laws that bear the royal signature and is found guilty of violating the provisions of the law. Now, the ministers were answerable to the Shah if they relied on a verbal or written command of his as an excuse for failing to discharge their duties according to enacted laws. This is Article 28 supplement that was added on. Now, in 1907, of course, there are no enacted laws, so it wasn't, there was no basis for interpolating a minister according to this ambiguous thing. But nevertheless, on end of April 1907, that's just 4 months after the signing of the 4 months after the signing of the first constitutional law, the Majlis brought down the caretaker cabinet of the acting prime minister, Sultan Ali Khan Wazir Ahkam, in order to establish the principle of responsibility, ministerial responsibility to parliament. I told you they didn't interpolate them, but they just said, we have a few questions, and they said, who are you? We're the Shah's servants. You go to hell. We're not going to demean ourselves by appearing in parliament and answering your questions. So, but then, but of course, the Majlis won, and thus it was only with a supplementary fundamental law of October 8, 1907, that the principle of ministerial responsibility to the parliament was explicitly stipulated, Articles 58 to 70. From a comparative view, we should bear in mind that the Ottoman Constitution of 1878 thundered on the issue of ministerial responsibility to Parliament, Ottoman Parliament, which was unacceptable to Sultan Abdul Hamid, and a major reason for his suspension of the Constitution in 1878. Now, Articles 60, 61, 63, 67, and 68 of the supplement stress the responsibility of ministers to Parliament, and they're in fact drawn up by a committee during the clash with the ministers that I just mentioned, who had refused, in fact, to consider themselves answerable to the Majlis. Now, Articles 61 and 62, like the articles in this case of Bulgarian constitution, that's one of the few borrowings from that constitution, were intended to ensure the transition from autocracy to constitutional monarchy. And another Article 67 empowered the Majlis to dismiss any minister or the entire Council of Ministers with a vote of no confidence. Now, the right to appoint the Prime Minister, however, remained invested in the monarch. Now, after the Majlis re-emerged as a major force in constitutional Iranian politics, and that was really after Reza Shah abdicated in 1941. There's this long period of eclipse with the rise of Reza Shah in 1929 especially. He's becoming the new king and the new monarchy. But when he abdicated in 1941, his young son, Mohammad Reza Shah, that is the last Shah of Iran, began to submit his nominations for the prime minister to the Majlis for a formal vote of inclination, as it was called, before the actual appointment. Now, when in November 1949, the Shah appointed Mohammad Said as prime minister without calling for a prior vote of inclination by the Majlis, the former premier Ahmad Qavam and his party accused him of violating constitutional procedures. Now, as early as October 1945, the Shah wanted to amend the constitution in order to enhance his authority, royal authority, and by 1949, he had won the influential support of Sayyid Hassan Taghi-Zadeh, who was one of its original architects in 1907, certainly the architect of the supplement, and Taghi-Zadeh, who now argued that the constitutional law and the supplement had both been drawn up very hastily and required revision. Now, although the Constitution was amended in that year, the Shah was granted the right to dissolve Parliament, which he hadn't had before, but he failed to increase his constitutional power further by obtaining the right to veto legislation. During the ensuing constitutional crisis, that is the Mossadegh period, Mossadegh's 2 years as prime minister, 1951-53, he saw a paradox, somewhat reminiscent of what happened with the Young Turks in 1908 when they forced Sultan Abdul Hamid to restore the Ottoman constitution. Now, in the Iranian paradox in the early 1950s, it's the arch constitutionalist Mossadegh who's demanding extraordinary powers, while his conservative opponents in the Majlis, in fact, resisted this attempt in the name of constitutional order. And then, right at the end, he carried out a referendum, which again was unconstitutional. There was no provision for a referendum. It's this interesting issue of governance. In other words, in this early period, people think, well, this is it, the model, constitutional government is what you need to be modern and progressive. But as soon as they come to power, they don't like the parliamentary system because they want to do what they want, and executive power is, they find it too limited by those constitutions. Now, if the articles on governance under the Iranian constitutional monarchy of 1906-7 were taken from its blueprint, the Belgian 1831 constitution. Those in the 1979 constitution of the Islamic Republic of Iran were based on the 1958 constitution of the Fifth French Republic that had served as the model for Prime Minister Bazargan's draft published in the spring of 1979, that is before an assembly of constitutional experts was elected to and implemented Khomeini's theory of a mandate of the jurist Velayat Faqih was published. In fact, his theory was not known when the Bazargan drafted it was known, but it was not official. When this draft was made on the basis of the French Fifth Republic, de Gaulle's, of course, constitution. Now, that theory, in fact, was unveiled and incorporated into the constitutional theory of Velayat Faqih, which was ratified in December 1979, and it became its most spectacular, that is, its theocratic feature. Now, let me admit that in the second article that I suggested you look at, I really focus on that and at the expense of the issue of governance, which is today's topic. So I think I want to talk about the problem of governance a little more. Now, Velayat Faqih clearly eclipsed the principle of national sovereignty, which was nevertheless eclectically and inconsistently retained. And it placed sovereignty of the jurist at the apex of its constitutional structure and superimposed upon the articles pertaining to governance. Nevertheless, the latter survived from, that is the governance issue, survived from the Bazargan draft, albeit at a subordinate level. Now everything was pushed down under the supreme jurist, who is called the leader of the Republic, Islamic Republic of Iran. Now, here the most obvious comparative remark is that the governance structure divided the executive power of the state between a president and the prime minister, and did so more evenly than the Gaullist its Gaullist model, the French 58 constitution. Now, this meant that the typical problem of cohabitation of a president and a prime minister in the House of Power presented itself within a few years. And it was one of the components of the constitutional crisis of 1980s. The then moderate third president of the IRI, that is Said Ali Khamenei, the president, supreme leader, found cohabitation with the then radical Mir Hossein Mousavi, as prime minister, and Mousavi was the candidate against Ahmadinejad in the last elections. Positions changed, but certainly Khamenei was the moderate kind of modernist then, and Mousavi was the radical, and their cohabitation was increasingly difficult, and Khamenei complained to Khomeini about it. Cohabitation was probably not the main component of the constitutional crisis. In fact, the deadlock between the Guardian Council and the Majlis was probably a very important one, and also the issue of succession to Khomeini, because at that point it was possible to have a council of leadership, which would have, and then it would have to be the so-called sources of imitation, and so those two, I think, were the more important issues in this by the late 1980s. Nevertheless, when Khomeini convened the commission to amend, for the amendment of the Constitution in 1988, that is just the year before he died, solving the problem of executive cohabitation by centralizing executive power was one of the 7 tasks that he specifically assigned to the revision committee. Although many of the amendments were approved during the months after Khomeini's death in June of 1989, the Commission nevertheless faithfully carried out his instructions. The constitutional amendments of 1989 accordingly solved the problem of unsuccessful cohabitation of President and the Prime Minister by abolishing the office of the Prime Minister and by putting the cabinet directly under the President as the head of the executive power. Now, the office of the President was further strengthened by allowing him to appoint deputy presidents and by the creation of a Supreme National Security Council chaired by him. Now, when President Hashemi Rafsanjani lost support of the Majlis during his second term, that is in 1993-97, Article 124 came in very handy. What happened was that the Majlis kept rejecting his ministers, and he would appoint them vice president for that particular area. So the number of vice presidents increased quite a lot by the time he went out. There were 10 of them. So there was no way Majlis could really prevent him from having his ban as one way or the other. Now, the president's position vis-à-vis the leader, however, that is the supreme jurist, was significantly weakened. A new Article 112 established the Council for the Determination of the Interest of the Islamic Order as an organ of the state at the service of the leader. This council, usually called the Expediency Council, I call it the Maslahat Council, that's the key term there, Maslahat, had been set up by Khomeini ad hoc to solve the deadlock between the Majlis and the Guardian Council. Its function was now expanded after Khomeini's death in this final amendment. It was expanded beyond the original intent to impinge on governance. It was now also to advise the leader on, and I quote, the determination of general policies of the regime and on any other matter that the leader may choose to refer to it. Now, the Maslahat Council was, by the way, the Maslahat Council was thus made into an advisory arm of leadership, i.e. of the supreme leader, a supreme jurist, and was given the authority to determine major state policies. The already extensive powers of the leader in the Constitution, including the executive power, and I quote, in matters directly concerned with leadership, this is in 1979, he was the one to decide what was directly relevant to leadership, was expanded, giving him the power to appoint and dismiss the head of the Iranian radio and television, transferring from the president to the leader, to him, the responsibility for coordinating the relations among the three powers, and entrusting to him the above-mentioned determination of the general interest policies of the regime, which again was formerly one of the prime minister's functions, who didn't exist now. The 1989 amendments, however, did not solve the problem of cohabitation, but simply shifted it upward between the supreme leader, supreme jurist, as the clerical monarch and the head of the state, I should say, with much expanded executive power prerogatives. It shifted it upwards, cohabitation problem, between him and the elected president as the head of executive power, as he was now designated. The kind of, they said there are three heads of three powers. So the Majlis Speaker is now called the head of legislative power. The Chief Justice is called head of judiciary power, and the Prime Minister, the President is called the head of executive power officially. Now, between 1989 and 1997, a cohabitation between a new leader, this is Ayatollah Khamenei, and the new president, Ali Akbar Hashemi Rafsanjani, was workable because Rafsanjani really had been the kingmaker in the choice in the Assembly of Experts of the new king, clerical monarch, jurist, whatever you want to call him. And the latter actually was not very assertive, but cleverly and surreptitiously were putting his own men in positions of power, getting ready for Hashemi to go, and then he would act. But the cohabitation problem actually became very serious when Sayyid Mohammad Khatami was elected president in 1997 and immediately embarked on his reform program. Now, that just as he sensed the upcoming cohabitation problem, Ayatollah Khamenei, in fact, broke with the precedent of appointing the incumbent president as chairman of the Maslahat Council and appointed the outgoing president, that is Hashemi Rafsanjani, to that position. But he went far beyond that, especially after Khatami's supporters won the Majlis election in the year 2000 and frustrated all their reformist measures in the next 5 years with quite completely unscrupulous use of his constitutional powers and control of the Guardian Council and the judiciary. Now, to forestall the continuation of the cohabitation crisis, Khamenei helped his little man, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, who really had no other basis then, helped Ahmadinejad beat Hashemi Rafsanjani in the latter's bid for another term as president. Now, this solution worked actually for Ahmadinejad's first term, 2005 to 9, but not nearly so well when the latter began to act as his own man rather than the jurist supreme leader's man, and acted more and more assertively in his second term. Now, the leader had to resort to threats of impeachment to control Ahmadinejad in his last unruly years of tenure. Now, as no successor with a similar power, accumulated power to Khamenei, I think, is in sight, you may expect the cohabitation problem to be one of the many serious, probably one of the more serious ones that can arise in the case of Khamenei's death. As for comparisons within the Middle East, I think the potential for cohabitation, in fact, of powers exists obviously whenever the executive power is shared between a president and the prime minister. Now, Turkey comes to mind right away. When Recep Tayyip Erdogan became prime minister in 2003, after, in fact, his party, the AKP, Justice and Development Party, had this sweeping victory in 2002 national elections. When he became prime minister in 2003, there did arise, of course, a serious cohabitation problem between him and President Sezer, who had been the former president of the Turkish Constitutional Court. And of course, the Turkish Constitutional Court was the guardian of Kemalist secularism, etc. Now, even that problem was severe, even though the latter, that is President Sezer's authority, was not very extensive. It was there, but not too extensive. Now, as the AKP got 47% of the popular vote in 2007, Erdogan solved the problem by using its parliamentary dominance to put his own foreign minister, Abdullah Gül, in the top seat. Now, President Gül, in fact, disappointed many by not showing his independence when Erdogan began to unveil his plans, which had been actually pre-announced in his infamous earlier remarks that democracy is like a train. You take it to get you where you want to get to, and then you get off the train once you're there. He's denied, he's withdrawn that since, but obviously he meant it. And as we know from what he's doing now. But in fact, by not standing up to Erdogan, in fact, he avoided any cohabitation wrangles that might have arisen. Now, arguably the most important part of Erdogan's plan was to eliminate the cohabitation problem altogether by switching to a presidential system, and by doing so in two steps. The first step was by greatly augmenting the power of president and making the office directly elective. And he made the necessary constitutional changes approved by two referendums to become the first directly elected president of the Turkish Republic in August of 2014. Since then, he has set up a parliamentary commission to carry out the second step, i.e. switching completely to a presidential system. As of now, he doesn't have the necessary two-thirds majority in Parliament for a constitutional amendment, but he may be planning a snap election, and if that doesn't work, a referendum or both. But we'll see if he would do that. But I think that is, everyone knows that's what he wants. He certainly doesn't want a prime minister at all and he wants to have a president. He wants a presidential relation. Again, it fits the whole pattern that you find in the Middle East, as anyone who comes to power wants to increase the power of the executive at the expense of other branches of government, and certainly at the expense of the judiciary. Of course, one of his increased power is that he's appointed all the prosecutors, public prosecutors, judges of the Constitutional Court. He's fighting them, in fact, very clearly. And the pattern is again similar to even someone like Mossad Deb, who was kind of an arch constitutionalist, but his tenure was very short. We don't know where he would have gone for 2 years. But certainly, the Young Turks, they kept increasing executive power, and then you had this three-person, the triumvirate, with virtual dictatorial powers during the World War I. Now, in the post-2011 Arab world, in fact, there seemed to be no comparable cohabitation problem in Egypt and Tunisia, nor in the constitutional monarchies in Morocco and Jordan. And Tunisia, I think, is probably the most interesting case because right at the beginning, the constitutional problem, the problem of governance was solved by this historic compromise and the so-called three presidents formula, that the second party with nobody had, there are 19 parties, nobody had majority, but the party with the second largest number of candidates appointed the presidents. It's called the three president thing, because in French, of course, Tunisian, there is the Président de la République and the the President of the Cabinet is the Prime Minister, and then the President of Parliament is the third president. And so they shared power quickly then. That's interesting, but maybe other monarchies in Morocco and Jordan are interesting to compare, but I'll leave that for the discussion period because I'm running out of time. Instead, let me kind of conclude by looking at some unique features, or you can call it the unique feature, or unique features hanging together of the Constitution of the Islamic Republic of Iran in Middle Eastern or in Muslim perspective. Now, beginning with the, well, let me go back to the role of this unique organ, the Maslahat Council, the Iranian Maslahat Council, in governance in the Islamic Republic of Iran since it was constitutionalized in 1989. Now, you remember its original function, in fact, maybe, well, you don't remember, let me tell you. Its original function after it was written into the Constitution could be characterized as legislative, because what would happen in the case of the disagreement between Guardian Council and the Majlis, which was its first raison d'etre, the bills would go up there or dispute, and the Maslahat Council would simply decide what they wanted, and they were free to add anything to the law, and it would never come back to either Guardian Council or the Majlis. It didn't have to come back to Guardian Council because its members were automatically members of the Maslahat Council, but then it was, in other words, it was it was a function, it was really a kind of the third Senate. I mean, the Council of Guardian was a sort of, I mean, it's a special veto power, but then that could legislate. That was its first main function. But as I said, it also could set state policy, which is certainly executive function, state policy if the leader asked it to do so. There's actually one very important, few instances, but the most important example is, in fact, its completely radical reinterpretation of Article 44 of the Constitution in 2006. And the Article 44 originally said the economy has three sectors. The public was put first, then the cooperative, which turned out to be a joke, and then the private. And now they reinterpreted it to introduce so-called privatization into the Iranian economy. And the interpretation said that up to 80% of the economy should gradually become private sector. And it has. But what sort of private sector? Of course, there are all these companies formed by the Revolutionary Guards who are private. They now control completely the construction sector, which is the most profitable, obviously, section of the world, of Iran's economy and others. But that was an important thing because the leader asked them, they said, you are my advisors to set important economic policies. So reinterpret this and see how we can privatize. And they did it, of course, to the benefit of the Revolutionary Guards, who I think control at least as much of the Iranian economy as the Egyptian army controls the Egyptian economy. So In other words, there's no parallel then in the Middle East and North African constitutions that really comes to my mind, or I don't think there is one. But I think it highlights another important point, which is important in constitutional perspective. It highlights the fact that the IRI structure is constitutional structure of the regime is more hydra-headed than any in the Muslim world. Many of its organs can interfere in governance, but do so only periodically as they can be played against each other, as you have these possibilities. Hence, I think this is a final remark. I think something stands out as unique about Iran. Hence, their shifting predominance in different periods. The Majlis under Khomeini, presidency under Hashemi Rafsanjani, the Guardian Council under Khamenei, I mean during Khamenei's presidency, against him really, and more briefly and intermittently, the Maslahat Council as an arm of leadership when called upon in preference to other organs of this hydra-headed regime. Thank you. I think I'm keeping my time.
You are perfectly. You are. Thank you, Said. And also, yes, I realized that we somehow imposed our agenda to look back at the constitutional politics through the lens of governance. Mm-hmm. But I think that you actually gave us exactly the example that we were looking for. That is, instead of looking at, for instance, at the development of constitutional politics in Iran through the lens of, for instance, of ideology or focusing heavily on Islam, you actually showed us that by using the category of cohabitation, for instance, that can be useful in understanding the politics that happen there, irrespective of the legitimacy source of the various institutions. So, in other words, regardless of the supreme leader having a popular legitimacy or theological legitimacy, the kind of dynamics of power and governance in that context illuminate that context more than the ideological leanings of different actors. So thank you very much for bringing this perspective. So I will not take more time, so the floor is open. If you have questions, please. Wait for the mic for those who are connected through the webinar.
Tomorrow seems to be election for Assembly of Experts and parliamentary election.
Yes.
There is a school of thought where I was looking at papers by Middle Eastern and LSE that young people, there is a very evident that the secularization is taking place. A lot of young Iranians are converting themselves to Zoroastrians or Baha'is. Do you think this will impact on the elections or some way? And the other thing I want to also ask you is all the Middle Eastern states, including Iran or North African, are not Westphalian states. They are sort of there is nothing precisely like in Westphalian, you see the argument goes there. So I would like you to enlighten me on these two terms.
Yes. Fine. The two completely different questions. Sure. The first one, I have no information, no numbers or any kind of information on the conversions you mentioned, but secularization certainly is far more extensive than that, and among especially the younger generation. These elections are very, very important. The Council of Constitutional Experts again showed the selective power of Guardian Council. In fact, you see, right now the Guardian Council doesn't need to veto any legislation now. Their main function has shifted to controlling, to being gatekeepers as to who can run and who cannot. So they're actually less than 2 candidates for every seat of the Assembly of Experts. Now that's important, of course, for Khamenei is not young, but I think the mullahs, the ayatollahs are real diehards, so I think he's a youngster compared to some of them, despite whatever is being said about his cancer and health or whatever. But anyway, that's not the main thing. It's a very, very important, I think, election, this one, for the Majlis, because as I said, now they've been playing this up that they're the 3 powers under the supreme leader, legislative, judiciary, and so the president, it's a way of putting down the president and raising up the other 2, head of judiciary and the, right now actually the head of the judiciary and head of legislative power are 2 brothers, the 2 Larijani brothers, or relatives of the the leader, the supreme jurist. But that will change. And so the Speaker of the House is very important. They're kind of trying to have a 2-party system, basically. They've formed these coalitions. Now they give a list of candidates per thing. I mean, not at the national level. It's not each constituency. In other words, Tehran has 30 seats, and only 2 lists now have been circulated. One by the conservatives, another relative of the Ayatollah, Haddad Adel, whom was a very charming man, actually. I met him 2 days ago, but somebody said that's only because it's the elections and he's developing this habit. Wait if he wins and to see him again. But much more important than him, of course, was his opponent, Aref, who's one of Khatami's reformers and one of the most secularist ones. He was a vice president again. That Khatami used that to some extent. I think he had various functions, but when none worked, he became Khatami's most important vice president. And for education, he was very important. He was a professor of engineering, so he he's changed things, or people under his influence. I can tell you that the faculty deans are much more competent secular people now than they were 2-3 years ago, and so forth. So this change actually is happening. So this election is very important because whoever controls one of the 3 powers, the other ones, of course, there's no hope of anyone challenging the head of the judiciary. That's in the leader's pocket, and the expert council. So it's a very important election, and yes, it is secularizing. As my example, I was there very shortly for 3 days, and I met only the people at the University of Tehran, the vice chancellors and deans, and they're all different, and they're all young and energetic and not into ideology or Islam or anything like that. The other thing is a very general one about Iran being a Westphalian state or not, nation state or not. I would say Iran is much more so Westphalian in your terms than some of them, certainly Iraq or Jordan or the post-World War I states, and not to mention the Gulf states. No. I mean, the Arab states that were part of the Ottoman Empire are still new. They're only 80 years old. Syria, Iraq, etc. But Iran, of course, is an old, ancient country. The idea of Iran begins in the 3rd century, really, with the Sasanian revolution. Then it's revived curiously by the Turco-Mongolians in the 13th century, 14th century, sorry, well, mainly 14th, but not by them, under Turco-Mongolian rule by their bureaucrats. And it continued, and in the 18th century, with the diplomatic things, they quickly start using the term of the Islamic State, and of course the older term is the Mamlek Mahruse, the God-protected realms, but that becomes very quickly by the 18th century equivalent of Iran, and so then Iran's fighting Russia, and they lose the war and give some of their provinces there, and so and so it's not really a new state. It's hundreds of years at least old and under the title of Iran. So no.
Thank you, Professor Arjomand, for the survey you have given us. My question really relates to the position of Iran vis-a-vis the outside world, and therefore its impact upon the mechanism and the dynamics of the constitution. And in particular, two factors, that is the Iran-Iraq war and Iran's relations with the West. Have they impacted upon the internal mechanisms and dynamics of the constitution making, as it were?
Yes. Of course, Iran, since 2003, is becoming more and more influential in Iraq, or what's left of it now with the Daesh separating. It didn't actually have much influence on the Constitution, which was really the American, American and United Nations. The United Nations, I think, chose a very bad electoral system, making Iraq the European model as one constituency nation, with lists of, which really didn't make sense, because if you don't have political parties, what is the meaning of lists? And of course, you have an extremely heterogeneous country, and you say, well, this is one unit, and it just really doesn't make sense. That really wasn't Iran's influence at all. And it was not the United States particularly, they didn't maybe notice it. It was really the United Nations giving very bad advice. There are all sorts of bad guys in the right. People who were responsible gave them this advice. I don't know them, luckily, but the big influence, of course, was not on the issue of governance, but on Islam, and of course that was the big, huge impact in 1979. That really lingered on and on for a long time until Al-Qaeda came, and then the Daesh, and then they took the, wind out of the sail of Iran completely on the export of revolution by Iran, and that's not so. But the governance really didn't have much to do with it. The last echo of it was really in Egypt, and it was a kind of a vague imitation of the Guardian Council under the Muslim Brothers, Morsi, 2012, 13 is the Sisi current constitution.
2012 was voted in 2013. Yes.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
oh, it was, okay, 12. Well, anyway, the Muslim Brothers constitution, or under them, which actually had provisions for a council of senior members of Al-Azhar to veto or to decide on what is compatible with Islam or not. When after the counter-revolution and July of 2013, the new thing reverts that back to the Constitutional Court, which is completely secular. And I don't know enough about Egypt. I was told that, in fact, the Sheikh al-Azhar wasn't too happy with it either, because he didn't want to be embroiled into politics to that extent. But as far as model of government, really, it had no impact. And of course, with the new model of radical thing, it has no impact at all, because it's Shiite, and the Daesh thing is fiercely anti-Shia, and going back to the the original caliphate. The new caliph is the Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, al-Husseini, etc. It's Abu Bakr, and all these commanders have the names of the Osama. Ibn Zayd was the first commander of Muhammad for the, and there's some Osama. There's all these new names of commanders. They're not into ideology at all, or constitution, or anything like that. So neither in the radical Muslim world nor in the others, I would say, Islam hasn't had Iran hasn't had any impact, constitutional impact, nor in Afghanistan, because that again was largely an internal thing. The Iranians really don't care about the constitutional thing as much as direct influence. Of course, in Iraq, they clearly influenced governments, change of governments. Now they made sure that the government is Shiite and so forth. And then again, the primary aim has changed, and the common enemy, in fact, the Daesh is more of a threat to Iran than the United States. And in fact, that's one of the unstated bases of the agreement between the United States and Iran, because I'm sure there's kind of a lot of intelligence things going back to way before the nuclear deal was signed, and they are cooperating militarily. But constitutionally, I don't think there's much interest. And as far as their interest in the Muslim world, the larger one, they're more interested in just setting up Shiite propaganda centers everywhere they can, rather than anything else.
If I can follow up on this. So if you take ideology out of the equation, it seems that the big questions of governance that have been addressed in the Iranian experience are not that dissimilar from the ones that have been, you mentioned, Turkey. You could look at Egypt or Tunisia with the model of a semi-presidential Cinquième République kind of problem and issues. So my question would be, is it possible to leave ideology out of the equation? And if so, what do we need to do for that?
That's partly or largely depends on the definition of ideology, of course. Now, if you consider democratic, constitutional democracy or liberal democracy non-ideology, which I do, I think ideology, I would tend to reserve that for total ideologies, the way that the Islamic Republic, the Constitution defines ideology as the basis of government, etc. That really was given up by all the Islamists who came to power, both in Tunisia and in Egypt. Nobody wanted that. Nobody said. The only thing that really persisted was the old, the Sharia is the principle of legislation, or a principle, etc. Now the Tunisian Nahda Islamists gave that up. I think Filiou calls it a historic compromise in March of 2012. That was really very early on, and then the constitution making dragged on for a long time. And now really it's not an issue, and of course they lost the elections and power and they went out. And so certainly in Tunisia the issues are issues of governance, economic development, things of that sort, certainly not ideology. Of course, the Tunisians for whom ideology matters have gone to the ISIS, and that's one of the heaviest, largest number of people who joined or are doing terrorist activities in Tunisia itself. Egypt, I can't see it coming back. The state has really reestablished its control of what is Islamic and not through the Constitutional Court, which really was the very close ally of the military in this, what I call the coup or constitutional counter-revolution of 2013. So that's out. No, I think right now, what may be important, I think, in answer to your question, is that this notion of a ideology as a basis of a constitution is completely out. And in Iran, of course, it can never go out because that's the basis of government. But then the interpretation of the ideology has changed completely, so that it's whether or not you're for the supreme jurist. Now, there's very little ideological defense of that, but it's simply they say this is our regime, and if you're against it, you're a traitor, basically. And traitor, I think, is important for my purpose, because it's not an ideology. They don't say you're an infidel; you say you're a traitor to the Westphalian nation state of Iran, which is now the Islamic Republic of Iran.
Sarah.
So if I'm hearing the thrust of your comments correctly, you've given the genealogy of the executive.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, do I need to repeat?
Yeah.
Okay. If I'm hearing you right, I think you've given a very careful and historical genealogy of the executive authority, and in so doing, brought in, of course, legislative authority and spoken about this cohabitation issue. I'm wondering if you were to be more explicit in describing sort of the, if the emphasis were shifted in your conversation, if you looked at it from just a different angle, but also genealogical, thinking about the issue of legislators, of ministers, of what might even be called sort of popular opinion, how would the narrative change? I mean, what would be the points? I mean, I can see that you've offered a critique, through what you've done, but if you shift it in that direction, what would you say differently?
Mm-hmm. Yes. Well, by the way, the one thing is the reason, I think, behind this prominence of this problem in Iran and receding of ideology, a small part of it is incidentally linguistic. There is no definite article in Persian, so there can't be any fight about whether the Sharia is the source or a source of legislation. In Afghanistan too, that's very lucky. In both of them, it's either source or no source. There is not a or the is only to be understood by the context. And the second thing is that there never was this confusion. That's why ideology receded in Iran, which in 1979 its constitution says it's explicitly an ideological state by them. But the reason why it went out, I think, because it was supposed to be Islamic ideology, was precisely because these issues didn't really make sense. Of sovereignty of God. They had the Shah there all the time, and now they said there's someone else, the Ayatollah. There's not, I mean, the if I were to give the kind of genealogy you want, I go to Pakistan and they say, well, we want to have a parliamentary democracy and we're Muslims, and who's more important? Is it God or the nation? And of course, for us Muslims, God's more important than the nation. That kind of thing, confusion wouldn't arise in Iran because they knew they got rid of the Shah. And now, not everyone thought that they would get a clerical monarch instead of him, of course. But the ones who didn't actually wanted a strong president. So if one were to do that kind of genealogy, of course, you'd go to the constitutional revolution. But then I couldn't carry out my commission. In other words, I couldn't make governance central because then it was, to begin with, it was all the Majlis versus the Shah, basically, during the first four years of since 1906 to 1911, basically. And the Majlis, of course, and actually most people would do just what you want. They would give that genealogy and said it was derailed, it was hijacked, it was this and that, and now we're going back to constitutional parliamentary republic finally. If I did that, but the problem is that I can't talk about constitutions. I can talk about constitutional politics, of course. With Khatami's reform movement that I mentioned, all the talk, the debate was between the republicanism of the regime and its Islamicness. And these reformers were said, no, Khomeini wanted to set up a republic. That means a constitutional democracy. The other guy said, no, he wanted to set up Islamic government, which is the Velayat al-Faqih, and so kind of that. But certainly that shift was there, of course, but it never translated into any change of constitution, didn't get anywhere near it. And of course, the new approach of this candidate, for instance, RF for the Majlis Speaker, and the reformists in the new Majlis is avoid completely issues. By the way, Rouhani did the same thing. There wasn't any reference to ideology in his Ahmadinejad, of course, kept saying his ideology was, the martyrs of revolution and the kind of the populism and people, etc. Now, he would probably write genealogy differently, and he would say, in fact, it was neither Islamicness nor republicanism, but it was Khomeini's was the revolution of the Mustazafin, the wretched of the earth, or whatever. That means the people whom Ahmadinejad was forcing his ministers to go and have their cabinet meetings in these small towns, and he was kind of going around and doing largesse and those sort of, helping them, setting up marriage funds for them, etc. So that would be what he would have done if he had, but he did so many other things wrong, and certainly his second term was a complete disaster in anyone's assessment. So nobody's following that. And so now these reformers are going back to doing just what Rouhani is saying and said in his elections, efficiency, economic development, meritocracy, and things of. And as I said, I think to a large extent that's reflected in the changes, as indeed the populism was reflected in Ahmadinejad's change. He just completely replaced the entire government bureaucracy at the higher level. Rouhani's done the same. Once more, he's thrown out Ahmadinejad's men, and I think certainly compared to them, anyone would be technocratic, but they are. I think they're much better in the sense of, but better is not part of your question, but they're completely non-ideological as far as you're concerned. You have to run the government. The government has to do things. And
so actually thinking about Sarah's comment, because at the very beginning, you're actually addressing the issue of executive-legislative relations with ministerial responsibility, right? And then somehow, once you get to the point where ministerial responsibility is established, somehow the assembly moves into the background. And then you concentrate on the structure of the executive. So I wonder if also part of rethinking Sarah's question, if part of her and of the answers to that could be, so what happened to the legislative, or how did the legislative play into this struggle that you told us was basically a struggle within the executive? Would that make sense?
of course. Well, if you want to look at that problem, you see what the Majlis really lost out, to be precise, in the year 2000, when the vast majority of them declared themselves to be reformists, whatever that they mean under Khatami. At that point, of course, the executive assertion of executive priority over legislative took an Islamic form, ideology. What Khamenei did was to say that the supreme jurist is the leader of the republic, and he used this thing that this category that come up, hukm hukumati, that is governmental ordinance, I translated it. He told them to shut up. He said the Majlis, they had kind of this press, freedom of press legislation under control. A lot of excitement in 2000. Of course, he had one of the main architects of the victory shot. He almost died, had Jarian right then, and at the same time he issued, well, he didn't, somebody shot him, but it's clear where the orders came from. But at the same time he issued this governmental ordinance to tell the parliament to shut up. Now, in this case, it wasn't the president who did that, but it was Khamenei who used ideology in our terms, or Islam, to basically strengthen the leadership position enormously. Since then, the Majlis has been subservient, and that's the reason why the Guardian Council is not needed to combat the Majlis anymore. They just control the elections and choice of people. The functions of these, actually it would be an interesting thing if we extend the governance issue into the relationship between the three, and of course the third minor power, the judiciary power, also plays a role, depending on who can control it. But in this case, in Iran's case, of course, it's on the side of leadership. So it is, you see, the Majlis wasn't really put down to increase executive power. It was really debilitated to increase the power of the leader. But the basis was certainly that the leader is entitled to issue a governmental ordinance which is incumbent on the parliament to obey. And indeed, if the dissidents could be tried by the judiciary for not doing that. Now, so that's, well, this is a very peculiar thing, isn't it? I don't know how much you can generalize that into the other Middle Eastern countries. But now that's pretty much over. Of course, it would come back. The Majlis could become assertive again. I mean, these relative things could shift constantly. Right now, depending on who becomes the next president, presidency could certainly reassert itself. The current president is doing so because the president still controls the budget and runs the government. The reformers in Iran are very unlucky. Each time they come into power, the price of oil goes down. So although he controls the budget, he has no money. He hasn't been able to pay people's salaries for 3-4 months in some government. But in theory, of course, the price of oil could come up, and then the president would have a lot more power and so forth. Same with the Majlis, of course. That's not going to die. At some point, they'll come back and start reasserting themselves. Perhaps, I think, my prediction would be with this time in alliance with the executive against the leader, because especially if he dies and there's a leadership. So they may come back. So in other words, this is going back to the hydra-headedness. So you have so many organs, and the power could shift between them, and it's just not, although it makes sense to kind of shift the focus and look at governance, but you basically have to put that then in the context of this shifting balance among other things. I mean, it's not a genealogy of it, but certainly it's variation in the power of the Majlis that is very important as far as, of course, the young people and so forth. They always they want they want both the Majlis and the president to be stronger. I think whether they can do that or not remains to be seen.
Thank you very much, and please excuse my my ignorance probably in this question, because I'm not a real Iran expert. I was wondering, you were describing very much the changes within the organs, the setup of Iran from an internal perspective, an internal power struggle. I was wondering whether the demonstrations in 2009, 2010, and 2011, 2012 had any impact on the organizational structure, and if not, why?
Why? Well, because they were actually, because that brings in a very important factor in the power structure, which is really touched on very minimally by the Constitution, namely the Revolutionary Guards and its mobilization corps, Basij, which were used both to suppress those very prolonged protests, the Green Movement, so-called, for a very long time. Now, what can you say about that? Again, very little that in constitutional terms, but in terms of certainly political regimes, you could say that these mobilizational regimes very quickly turned, and the Basij was a mobilizational arm of the Revolutionary Guards. The Revolutionary Guards themselves were to protect the revolution. But after the Iraq-Iran War, 1988, Hashemi Rafsanjani said, well, let's use your engineering, and instead of armament, you also start building other factories. Instead of building bridges and logistics for the army, go into the very profitable business of building high-rises and selling it to the new middle class, etc. They did that, so they're quickly. I mean, they always controlled the black market economy, but the actually official economy came under their control, very much shifting from the so-called foundations and etc. But in terms of political, I think mobilizational regimes, I would say that they very quickly, the mobilization or arm turns into the so-called security forces that are always used for intelligence and political police purposes, etc. Same thing happens in Iran. And then the other thing is that the Revolutionary Guards are just beginning to taste power. And they certainly didn't want to be challenged by the Greens and the youthful person. And their people in their generals were in their 50s and so forth, as opposed to the generals of the Egyptian mobilizational regime, which were in their 80s or 70s, the field marshal and a couple of others that were left over. So they were kind of used, I think, very severe, I think, repression, a lot of tortures, imprisonments, and it went on for a long time. I mean, not a huge amount of violence, but certainly quite a bit of violence in the case of forced to suppress the Green movement. But now they came back. I think with the Rouhani, I think many of the same people came back. And now they have a sense that there is a division of labor between, the Revolutionary Guards certainly do what they want in terms of arresting people, in terms of security measures, and military matters, of course. And the reason for this deal, nuclear deal, is that, of course, the leader wants it, Khamenei, and if you remember, the president negotiated with Europe for him. Rouhani was the head of this national security with the so-called big deal with the EU in 2005, and then Zarif, the prime minister, is also very close to him. And basically, he just told them, go and do it, actually. President Rouhani said more or less as much. He kind of slipped out of his thing, and of course, people thought that he was against Khamenei. He backed these hardliners. Khamenei, the Ayatollah, backed the hardliners, whom he knew had no chance of winning, but he trusted Rouhani much more. He'd been his head of his, Rouhani had been representative of this leader, supreme jurist, in the National Security Council, and came to and negotiated with Europe, and then Bush rejected that in 2004, 2005. Now, so this time, it's whatever he said, of course, it was a kind of a bargaining thing, and he said to get some more advantages from the Americans, especially. They really got very little, by the way. This is a very good deal, very bad deal for Iran, if you look at it that way, and a very good deal for the United States. And that's why I don't understand these Republican crazies in the election. They say they don't want that. But so this really takes us into consideration of the structure of not the constitutional regime, but the power structure of the regime in Iran, which then brings in the Revolutionary Guards.
I think we have one more. Yeah.
Online audience. So they're asking, did the sectarian tensions with the Sunnis play a role in helping the religious hierarchy maintaining its grip on power strong?
What was the first part? Who helps them?
So it says, did the sectarian tensions with the Sunnis
Tension with the Sunnis? I was surprised as to how little discussion of the Daesh there has been in Iran. I think it's been done very quietly by the Quds force of the Revolutionary Guards and the Americans in Iraq and Syria. Of course, there's a hero this General Qasem Soleimani, who's been running Iraq, and he went as soon as the Daesh got their first victory, he quickly was dispatched to Iraq. You do see his picture, and then as a possible candidate for president or a strong man. He is from the Revolutionary Guards. The mayor of Tehran is also from Revolutionary Guards, and he said it's time we go back. He praised Reza Shah as a colonel, as a military man, and he's a military man, and he said, we need someone like me to go in. But of course, but then this General Qasemi is completely eclipsed him, and he was for a while considered the war hero until they haven't been making much headway against Daesh, etc. So he would be. So the only effect, the answer to that question, is really by promoting the military, this general who's fighting the Sunnis in Daesh, the Sunni radicals, extremists, but he was there was a suicide attempt against him very seriously, and we don't know how well he is. He's not making too many. That was quite a few months ago. Somebody said he wasn't sure if he was alive or dead because but anyway, I suspect he's alive, but we don't know how, because that was serious. There was somebody from an insider who grabbed him and detonated the bomb. Yeah, so but I would say the answer is surprisingly little effect in Iran. They're much more preoccupied with these issues of governance, especially economic issues, opening up the country to the West and so forth. There isn't not 1/10 of the amount of attention paid to Daesh in Iran as it is in the United States.
Well, we cannot but thank you, Said, and for your contribution, and also for really engaging with our themes, and you definitely helped us move forward with our program. So I think we are all thanking you for this. Thank you.